So here we are again, and we are continuing some of our discussion about witchcraft and the occult and some of our pasts. My friend here just shared a whole lot about her story, and you can see that in the video I hope to have linked below. And but now she wanted to have some opportunity to ask me some questions about where I came from, and that is what we are going to do now. So go ahead, you just had a question.
Yeah, my question was, you asked me what drew me to the occult, so that's my same question for you. Like mine was wanting that power and control in my life that I felt I was lacking.
Well, I think part of it is that culture presented it as something that was cool,
Hmm.
something that was fascinating. Um, it just was, I think it was more of like a curiosity motivated, because I grew up right in the midst of just the whole Harry Potter era. Like,
Hmm.
every time a book was coming out about Harry Potter being a certain age, like I was that age, like
Mm.
right around that age, and it was just crazy. Like the enthusiasm about Harry Potter and stuff is like comparable to just the insanity of the mania surrounding the Beatles and everything. It was
Hmm.
just totally like pretty unprecedented, or at least comparable to things like Star Wars.
Oh yeah.
And but Star Wars was not a book, first in the same way anyway. And but I grew up with all that too, with Star Wars, with it just like those things were just these huge just idols in my life. Like I looked to Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi as like my role models, and similarly I could see that Harry Potter and all this stuff was presented as like these innocent heroes
Hmm.
using magic to uh, save the day. And so for me, it seemed totally natural for my mother to just like hand me a book one day, or I forget how it all happened. I do not know if I picked it out and she bought it for me or handed it to me, but around like 11, 12, 13 years old, I was just handed this purple book with big gold letters that just said how to be a wizard, and in the back it taught you how to write in these ancient runic languages, and then it taught you how to cast different spells and make your pendulum and practice divination and this and that. And that was just like, well, how am I supposed to not how can you read a book that's like a how-to guide and not actually do it,
Yeah.
like, so
Put some of that into practice.
I went ahead and did it. I learned the languages, I wrote the stuff. I had like in my Dungeons and Dragons binder, like it was all written in those like runic languages. And I remember it's fascinating what you shared with me about that sort of ascent to almost godhood, that you
Hmm.
are like on this trajectory. Because like when I was role playing, I chose to role play as this this bard character who was a musician slash magic user that could use different things like that. And this character, like as he developed, as I role played him, I modeled him after this ancient character from like Celtic mythology who could like shapeshift and do all these things. And gradually, as he developed, like he had his like the character I was role playing as like had his sort of ascent to godhood. Like every
Hmm.
single spell I chose to use from the game was a spell that had to do with like godlike ability,
Mm.
like clairvoyance and things like that, where I could know everything and see everything and like be like omnipotent, omnipresent. Like it was like this bizarre, um, like that's not really the word I want, but I could see that parallel in that like this character I was role playing as was not like seeking to glorify God. He was
Hmm.
seeking to like exalt himself and lift
Hmm.
himself up into this powerful being.
Hmm.
And I recognize now that there is no more powerful being. There are no more powerful beings than like the Father, our than God the Father and His Son, Jesus Christ, and that I can choose to serve them, and that I can be a soldier in their army, and that there is nothing more cool, nothing more epic,
Hmm.
nothing more awesome than, instead of playing Dungeons and Dragons, and pretending to fight darkness, to become a Christian, to enter into that army, to stand under that bloodstained banner of Jesus Christ, and to go to war.
Amen.
So, um, so that explains some of where I came from in my past in that regard. But I'm curious what other questions you might have.
Well, first I have a comment about the Harry Potter. I was 18 when the first Harry Potter book came out, and my mom got it for me. I think actually somebody had given it to her, and she brought it home to me, and she just thought, "Oh, this looks like something that you might be into." And I read it, and there are many adults that are obsessed with Harry Potter too. It's not just it's
No,
across the board.
It doesn't discriminate.
And you're absolutely right, because I went to those midnight Harry Potter release parties and stood in line for my book, and I look back on that, and the stuff that's in those books, it's actual language that you use in spellcasting, and people are letting their children read it.
Yeah. And I understand that the author had some history with that. She was familiar enough with that to include those things.
Yeah, it's very purposeful. So yeah, I totally understand that. And then my second question for you was, you had asked me about opening doors. Did you open any of those doors in your life that you had, encounters with darkness?
Yeah, absolutely. There were definitely some doors open. To say when and how is hard to pinpoint, but even just trying to find out where and when where that line is between oppression and possession and things like that. It's hard to even identify. But first, um, it's hard to know where to start. I so rarely talk about this that it is not like other parts of my testimony where I have a rhythm and I've practiced and gone through it.
Yeah.
So there are some prominent events in my life that I can endeavor to recall and hopefully can be brought to my remembrance. Well, around age around my teenage years, like when I was 13, 14, even earlier, I really started to struggle with severe depression and severe, just intense depressive episodes, and episodes of just being just really confused and just struggling to sleep. And there were times where I just was thoroughly deceived by the enemy, and I really struggled with that over the years. And by the time I was 16, 17 or so, like, I was just completely just persuaded that I was this very significant, like, being. I had to go out and do this, mighty thing. I had these really just confused delusions of, like, grandeur. And it's a very common thing that people are just, like, thoroughly persuaded that they're a prophet, or that they're Jesus, they're some Messiah, they have this role to play in apocalyptic events, and they're just like, people get convinced.
Yeah.
And I could go into all sorts of details, but like, I just was right in there in that sort of thing for a while, and I just was so thoroughly persuaded that I needed to get ready for something that was coming, and I was, I was putting myself into debt to, like, accomplish these outlandish goals, and saying these bizarre things and making these claims that are just totally outlandish and completely confusing. It's like, it was just completely unreasonable, and yet I was so convinced. And that's how it is, like, when you get into that mode, that you almost need to kind of crash before you can like pick up the pieces and examine and be like, well, what happened?
Yeah.
And but sadly, what often happens with people who have these cycles of just deep despondency, total loss of hope and courage, and then these times of confusion and distress and these struggles, is that like when they do crash, they almost have to like mourn like the loss of all that time and like the relationships that they damaged and the struggles that they had, and it just like is like this. You're already prone to depression and discouragement in that time just because of whatever frailties me and people like me might have had or have due to sin and just years of falling. But because of that, it's just it's just so much. What I was going to say is that many people like that are already so vulnerable, and then they have the additional weight of all of their mistakes and like confused delusions and this and that they have to struggle with and wrestle with, and the temptation to just like end your life or just give up or like hide in a hole, lock yourself in your room or whatever, is so high.
Yes.
And I had to deal with that sort of embarrassment and recognizing I was wrong and recognizing I was struggling. And but the thing is, when you make big mistakes, you can learn in a big way. And I was able to gradually learn some ways I was able to learn more quickly, and sometimes it took me a long time. But over the years, those struggles became more and more subdued as I began to study the Bible more and more. Because one of the things about people who get into that mode is that they tend to become like deeply like devout and religious and almost like have this like obsession with spiritual things. And so I as well as I could at the time, I studied and I read and I learned and I prayed and I was just really sincere, but I just still was confused and just afflicted by all this darkness. And I think that a big part of that was dabbling in that witchcraft as a child, being deep into the the dark parts of Dungeons and Dragons and the like Magic the Gathering that I played. And I'm not so um, I don't I find that some people can be like really extreme with how they look at that stuff and say like, sort of like how someone might say like sports is competitive and violent, and then jump to it's wrong to throw a ball.
Oh, yeah.
Like I feel like some people are like, there's bad things about like the ways that certain people use role-playing games or the ways that people play card games, and for some people it's consuming, therefore like you shouldn't even touch it. And maybe that's some good advice to not touch it, but I think it's a bit extreme. um, this is not the time where I want to really articulate my exact views, but I just wanted to make that clear that like some Christians just like have this really like, I think, firm stance, whereas like I think like, because like, for example, one of the books that you and I both are familiar with is Thoughts from the Mount of Blessing, and in that book, the author writes that she invites people to imagine themselves being in that scene, and almost like suggests that you like put yourself into the role of an observer, like watching the Sermon on the Mount. And that sort of exercise of imagination is like can be put to a sanctified use. And similarly, like I could say like you walk into a town and you see people who are hungry and you have what do you do? Like in Dungeons and Dragons, you could be like, well, I'm gonna chop off their heads and steal their stuff, and it's like, well, that's clearly entertaining a poor quality of character. But you could say like, well, I endeavor to feed those people, or like invite them to come with me and we can go do some work to help them to find some life-giving. Like
Mhm.
um, cards are not wicked. Role playing, I do not think is wicked, but it can be used to a wicked purpose, and that's
Mhm.
my point. Um, so, but yeah. So as far as doors that were opened, it's hard to even talk about because I just don't even know what to say. But like I would just um, because I was not one who had sleep paralysis. I was not really haunted in my dreams so much, but I at times during the times when I was awake, especially when it was dark, I just would would be conscious of these dark presences, and it's not like I would see them like I would see you,
Mhm.
but I had like this awareness, like I sort of was like seeing through, and I do not know if I was just confused into thinking I was seeing something or if I was seeing through some veil into something else, but for whatever the cause, like I was quite confident I was seeing like an entity in the corner, and or that there was something, that there was a presence that was following me, and I would draw these things at times with like, because as an artist I did pastel work and different things like that, and I would draw these things, and I remember describing some of this, like a friend would describe something that she has seen, and I showed her some of my art one day, and it was, she just, the way she reacted, it was quite clear that this very same entity that I had intended to depict, that she was familiar with
Mm.
that dark presence.
Mm.
And I remember that I started to memorize scripture. I started to try and respond to these things with prayer, and that those when that is when it really started to, when the most meaningful experiences really started to happen, because I remember I was on the phone one day with my friend, and we um, there was just this dark presence in his home, and we really prayed that it would be cast out, and we prayed earnestly and faithfully, and it left his home, but I was immediately aware that they just left that place and like came immediately to where I was,
Mhm.
and it was not like I saw like a definite shape or anything, but just I was aware of this, like these three like dark, like shadowy entities, and we prayed, and again, just that God would send His angels, and we the ex- I think back on these experiences, and sometimes I wonder like why I had those experiences at that time in my life, and why things are different now, and it's a different, it just, things have changed, and I sometimes wonder why that is, but I think part of it might have been just at that time, in like in regard to those types of things, I had just such immense faith, and I just firmly believed that God would send angels, and that I had, that He could open my eyes to see that, to like, maybe not in the fullness of their being, but I could have
Mhm.
just even just a glimpse, and just some sort of just awareness of their presence, because it's not like some people, like I know angels can manifest and they can be easily just as seen, like I could see them just as well as I could see you, but that was
Mhm.
never my experience.
Mhm.
It was more like, rather than like um, a wall obstructing like the veil between this world and that, like that spiritual realm, like it was like just like ever so slightly transparent,
Mhm.
and that's sort of been my experience, and but when we had prayed again, like I just the speed, like even faster than those entities like left my friends, where my friend was, to came to where I was, like it was just like a flash of lightning, and then Angel was there, and he just was like, he like escorted them away and right out the door, and he stood there at the back door, and that was the general awareness that I had of the situation. It was just really, really incredible that these dark, like swirling, shadowy entities were just there. We prayed, and like a flash of lightning, it was just and they were gone.
Mm.
And that was a really incredible uh, memory for me and a moment for me, because I firmly believed that there that that he had given us power to tread over serpents and scorpions, and that we could call on the authority of Jesus Christ. And we had other situations like that. There was a friend of ours who had been dabbling in witchcraft and had her tarot cards and all sorts of stuff, and she was really afflicted. She had all these different visions and stuff, and I was asked to go and uh, and pray over her, like the basement area that she was in. And I just remember going in there and just having that that awareness of like that darkness, and praying over all of that. And uh, I suppose another instance I could comment on was, I remember one day I just was so afflicted. I just felt like I was under attack. Like there just was this particular demon that was familiar to me. He just was like this big hulking like monstrosity of a thing that just kept on tormenting me. And I'd be outside and I would have awareness of his presence there, and I'd go in and I would like there was just I could not find rest.
Mm.
And I felt like I just needed to like run and get away. And for whatever reason, I felt like physically running was like the only thing I could think to do, even though what I really needed to do was run into the arms of Christ and like plead for his aid. But I struggled to have that awareness and that understanding of what to do. So I remember leaving my house, and I remember I took out my bike, and then my mom like asked me my bike. I was trying to sneak my bike out, and or something, and my mom like sort of asked me something, but she didn't see that I had my bike, and then she went up to sleep, and then I snuck my bike out, and I was driving, and I was actually driving right, as far as I remember, riding my bike, like right on this road where like there was the Catholic church I like grew up by, and the Ukrainian Catholic church I grew up going to. And I remember, and this was unique because I never remember any other instance where I saw like any sort of manifestation in any sort of physical way of any sort of entity. But I remember like I was going down the road, and I just had this like intense awareness of like a darker presence than I'd ever like experienced before. And like it was just like a moment, and I was able to like look up into the sky, and it was like the whole sky was filled with like this whole like this monstrous shape of like a dark like demonic being. And it actually took like the form in the cloud, and it was like I didn't even look at it. Like I knew I needed to like turn around.
Mm-hmm.
But it was like it was this dark ominous presence, but it also was like an invitation.
Mm.
It was like, come, and serve me,
Mm-hmm.
and you can have all this. Like it was like a moment that I could choose like what direction I wanted to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that critically it was a critical moment in my experience. And I just I stopped. I glanced up for a moment, and I just did like immediately. I just turned around,
Wow.
and I was done. And I went home, and it was sometime after that that I started being around like more Christians. A friend of mine started to took me to like a men's group where people were able to like pray for me and like guide me along. And it my journey continued, and as I got closer and closer to Christ, and as I walked more and more with him, like I was totally delivered from any sort of affliction in that way that I was familiar with for so long, because it went on for many years.
Mm.
And understandably it's not something that I I I, I choose to talk about with almost anyone.
Yeah.
But it was and whatever it was very real
Mhm.
in my life, and I can. So, those are some of the key experiences I had that come to mind right now. But I welcome any other questions you might
That's an amazing testimony.
have.
I think my question to you, because I think it's a very important one that you had asked me, was what is your advice to anyone that's in this and doesn't know how to get out or has started to come out? Like, what would you say to them? What would you want them to know? Or what is something that you wish somebody would have said to you that would have been very helpful to you?
Well, I want to address like several lies that the enemy brings forth, and one of them is that you are special in this certain way, because you are special not because you can have some special power from within yourself, or that you can cast this spell or influence this or that, but you are special because God so loved you that he gave his only son, that he chose to have his son willingly come down as an innocent man to die for you, and that he was, tortured, murdered, buried, and then was resurrected and lives now, and he sent his spirit to be with us and to work with us, and that is the true power, that God can use us as his instrument. As we surrender and we decrease ourselves, we can let Christ in us be used. Because I felt like so convinced that I was special because I had some special role to play or some significant thing. And the reality is that those things may very well be true, just as much as they are true for each of us.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have a role to play in this war, and we can choose to labor to have more and more souls on the inside of that celestial city, or to be part of the army of darkness that is endeavoring to take it over.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is one lie, is that you need to be special in some way of yourself, and not special because who you are to God, in relation to God. And secondly, is that we've been given power to tread over serpents and scorpions, that even the devils are subject unto us through his name, through Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach, the Savior, and we can claim that authority. So,
Hey, you guys. Are you doing a YouTube video?
yes. Um, so, it can be easy when you're in this world to think that these entities have so much power, and there's so much to be scared of. But I just want to assure people that there is a greater power, that we have a Heavenly Father and his Son who died for us, and that we can claim the authority of his name, and his very presence can be with us, and through his very power we can cast out devils. So there is hope. And all right. So is that all for your questions?
I think so this time. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for.
Well, I have very much enjoyed this. Thank you for this conversation.
Well, I'm glad we could have it.
I hope people out there got something out of it and this helped somebody. That will be very much worth it. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you, And thank you all for watching. And I don't know if the cat wants to say goodbye, but he's our special guest. And show him, my friends.